Here we are, at the finale of this series. This last video will do no justice to the true philosophical implications of dominance and duality, but I'll do my best to conclude with as much closure as possible. In the previous video, we began to talk about embodied cognition, or the idea that knowledge itself is both derived from and structured by the sensory-motor relationships that exist within a bodily form. This epistemological theory neatly explains how and why dominance and duality is so deeply embedded in our perceptual realities. Because, if anything and everything that we can possibly know is inherently associated with our body, then the entirety of conceptual space is an intricate web of orientational metaphors. In other words, our consciousness or vision is literally a space with physical properties. As an example, a feeling like sadness isn't just related to a specific event, say the death of someone I love. Instead, it's a piece of myself that exists within my vision and is associated with blueness, downward motion, and drooping, like the way my shoulders hang or my mouth curls into a frown. These orientational and embodied metaphors are not merely side effects or secondary properties of the feeling, but essential elements of my sadness. And in this video, we will discuss how surprisingly universal these specific elements tend to be. Previously, we talked about the relationship between orientational metaphor and the way that dominance is imbued in inner and outer spaces. Specifically, that the left dominates on the inside and the right dominates on the outside. And in the last video, we briefly touched on the idea that the dominance of the right also extends upwards, like the direction of heaven, while the submission of the left extends downwards, like the direction of hell. The conceptual relationships that emerge from embodied cognition extend far beyond spatial direction and into extremely abstract concepts. In fact, at its heart, this video series is really about how orientational metaphors act as the bridge that connects our internal vision to the reality of the world. Alfred Korzybski, the creator of general semantics, famously stated that the map is not the territory, that the content of our internal vision space should not be confused with reality. As Jordan Peterson puts it,
don't confuse yourself with archetypal realities. Right? Do not confuse the ego and the self. That's one way of thinking about it. Every person is the center of the cosmos from a metaphysical perspective, and that there's a big difference between being a center and the center.
Right. And this is an important sentiment to remember. My conscious perception does not equate to the truth. But even though vision doesn't perfectly map reality, it is nonetheless a map that corresponds to the world outside at some level. In other words, orientational metaphors and embodied cognition form the foundation of all knowledge by functionally connecting the contents of our vision to some kind of external reality, whatever that might be. Our subjective consciousness is an emergent property of orientationally embodied associations. These associations, despite being deeply personal and dependent on our unique experiences, are amazingly universal. For example, whether you are a native speaker of English, Arabic, or Chinese, you will associate happiness with upwardness and sadness with downwardness. The consistency of these orientational metaphors allows us to communicate, not just through language, but through gestures, expressions, and abstract symbolism. These shared connections that occur within conscious vision anchor every human to every other human through what Carl Jung called the collective unconscious. Even beyond this, the orientationally embodied cognitive structures that compose our perspectives don't just connect humans to other humans. Embodied orientation connects every living thing to every other living thing through abstract vision space in an indeterminably vast organic web. Because, after all, every living thing has a body, and every body shares at least some of its features with every other body. Even if each species has unique senses, processes, and forms, there are still features that every living body shares. For example, an inside and an outside, and a need to define and maintain this separation. We talked about this in part 2 in terms of blindness. Specifically, that the capacity to imagine and perceive conscious vision is independent of a sense of sight. Theoretically, conscious vision space can be constructed and utilized through any sensation, whether it be touch, taste, smell, hearing, or some sense that we cannot possibly imagine in our limited human form. But in a way, we could imagine it, because although the specific contents of vision vary from individual to individual, the underlying structure of consciousness is remarkably consistent across individuals. It seems as though conscious vision requires only two integrated components: spatiotemporal orientation, or where am I in space and time, and categorical definition, or what are the units that compose myself and the world. In part 2 of this series, we called these two features imagination and perception, and throughout this series we've discussed them in terms of the dorsal and ventral streams, the two pathways in the cerebral cortices of human beings through which information is processed from pure sensation into integrated vision. But in this 7th and final part of the Dominance and Duality series, I am claiming that these two features are ubiquitous among living things and are essential elements of all conscious vision, no matter how simple the level of self-awareness may be. And perhaps the universality of these dualities cannot truly be demonstrated, because any evidence that I could possibly compile would have to be filtered through the lens of human consciousness. However, one thing that we have explored is the dominance in this duality. I can't really state with certainty that the whole universe is imbued with dominance and duality, but given everything we've discussed over the last 7 videos, it certainly seems as though this dominance expresses itself in everything that we can know as human beings. To conclude this lengthy series, please consider the following statements with the awareness that each of these could fill an additional hour's worth of content. Dominance and duality is a vortical, spiraling engine that underlies the emergence of individual and collective identity. Dominance and duality drives the progression of human evolution through the provision of meaning and purpose, by molding our forms and awareness to the environment around us, and by exerting a force on the environment through our conscious vision. And finally, dominance and duality produces all evolutionary change, as it pushes and pulls to build miraculously complex forms out of any substance that it comes into contact with. Thank you so much for sticking with me to the end of this series, and let me know what you think in the comments below. As always, thank you for watching The Paradox Perspective.